Throughout the 1970s, filmmakers around the world were creating interesting, innovative and original vampire movies. In the US, bold new spins on the genre, like Ganja and Hess, Let's Scare Jessica to Death and Martin, were pushing the boundaries of what vampire movies could look and feel like. While over in Europe, films like Daughters of Darkness and The Blood-Spattered Bride were straddling both vampire horror and art house. But in 1979, Bram Stoker's Dracula novel once again returned to the big screen. In Hollywood, Universal Pictures resurrected their original monster, this time played by Frank Langella in a movie filled with glossy, high-end studio visuals. Meanwhile, over in Europe, a filmmaker from the new German cinema movement called Werner Herzog remade Nosferatu, but lent his own unique, chilling and bleak visuals to create an altogether different and unsettling experience. These two very different adaptations in 1979 once again proved how varied and how enduringly popular Bram Stoker's Dracula continued to be. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the vampire movie, and we discuss John Badham's Dracula and Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampyre. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 8th season, exploring the evolution of the vampire movie, and this is part 7. And in this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be discussing 2 Dracula adaptations from 1979. John Badham's Dracula, starring Frank Langella, and Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampyre, starring Klaus Kinski. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific, so please try and give these movies a watch before listening to our discussion. They are both really fun and really interesting movies. So let's get straight into it. I sat down with a friend of the pod and good friend of mine, Tim Robey, the film critic for The Telegraph. He hasn't been on the podcast in a very long time. He was last here during our Slasher series, the very first season of the pod. So it was a joy to sit down with him in his flat and get him back on the podcast. So here is my discussion with Tim Robey as we discuss all things Dracula and Nosferatu. Hello and welcome back, Tim Robey. Hi, Tim.
Hello.
Hello. So lovely to have you. It's been a while. Yeah, so lovely to have you back. Last time we were talking about It Follows, right? And sort of slasher, sort of teen slasher genre and that kind of thing.
It feels like in another century.
It really does, doesn't it? We've had a whole pandemic since then, haven't we? Exactly. Sometimes. But we are talking about vampires this time round. And before we get into these films specifically, I just wanted to ask you your opinion on vampire movies and the vampire subgenre. Are you a fan generally of vampire stories?
I am. I'm kind of a fan when they're done in a sort of serious, adult, proper way.
Not
in a kind of silly knockabout kind of teen movie way, I will admit. Mm-hmm. So I think that the genre has taken a bit of a hit lately.
Not a reason. Twilight fan?
Not a big fan of Twilight. But I'm a fan of Let the Right One In, so there's still ways of doing it, you know. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I suppose, like a lot of people of my generation, I'm in my mid-40s, I kind of grew up with the Coppola one, Bram Stoker's. That was my entry point into vampire lore, really. And I remember seeing that. I remember sort of sneaking in to see that when I was 14 in 1992.
Oh, wow.
It was an 18 cert. It was one of the first 18s I ever saw in the cinema.
Yeah, it was pretty racy, that film.
Oh, yeah, for sure, yeah. And I also remember reading it at the same time, except as was pointed out to me, I was not reading Bram Stoker's novel. I was reading the freaking novelization. So I read the novelization at the time, and then later read the proper book. You know, and I still have good memories of that as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? And you know, we've been talking these last few weeks about all these various different Dracula adaptations. What is it, in your opinion, about the character of Dracula or about that story that kind of lends itself, you know, to, I think, other than maybe Sherlock Holmes, it's become the most adapted character, story, ever. Why is that, do you think, with Dracula?
It is such an adaptable myth, isn't it? That's the thing. You can kind of, Dracula, in his shape-shifting way, can have so many different kind of identities and focuses, depending on the way you want to tell the story. And the two we're going to look at are quite good examples of how differently you can tell it, how differently you can kind of render the character. But also his immortality and his ability to straddle time means that you can kind of tell Dracula's story in almost any time period. Like obviously, as Hammer did with 1972, etc.
Yes.
So you're not stuck into one place in time. You can kind of go anywhere with him. So he's almost like the kind of the vampire Doctor Who, if you like.
It's so true, actually, isn't it? Lends itself well, especially connects well to the Stephen Moffat, Mark Gatiss adaptation, even, doesn't it? I think. What do you think? And before we get up to 1979. Previously we've talked about Nosferatu, the original, the sort of Bela Lugosi Dracula, the Hammer Dracula. Any particular faves of yours before we get to these two that we're about to talk about?
Yeah, I guess I like all of those films in different ways. I'm a big fan of the Hammer one. I think it's one of their best films. I think Christopher Lee is outstanding in it, and it looks so lush.
It does.
Yeah, it's a great film to see from a print, actually, if you get the chance. But I still have a lot of fondness for the Coppola one as well. Again, I think it's one of Coppola's best films, and it was a bit underrated at the time. It has obviously some aspects of dated badly. It has some dodgy performances in there, but it has such an interesting, vivid engagement with cinema history and with the early days of kinetoscope and all that kind of stuff. I love all the trickery in that, all the practical effects.
It looks gorgeous. It
looks great, and I love the kind of epic sweep of the story that he managed to bring to it. So I will always sort of stand up for that film, despite its many obvious deficiencies in some areas.
And do you think? I mean, you mentioned this at the beginning when I asked you about vampires. Do you think that vampires and Dracula in particular should air? It always feels like they're trying to get a balance of, should this be a kind of romantic character? Should it be a scary, monstrous character? What do you think? Where do you lie on the scale of what Dracula should be as a character, I suppose?
I'm pretty much happy for them to take me on any of those journeys they like, if they do it convincingly. I think, again, the comparison we're going to have and get to make here is quite extreme.
We get the two extremes.
In that regard, we do get the two extremes. But I liked what they did in the first episode of that BBC Dracula with Klaus Bang. I thought he was outstanding. I hated what they did with the rest of that series. They screwed it up. So you can bring out certain aspects of him, but you just need to keep a handle on it. And I guess the optimal Dracula, the Dracula of anyone's dreams, would be all things at once, extremely romantic, seductive, scary, lonely, interesting, all of these things, hideous at times, beautiful at other times. You sort of, and I guess they're sort of trying for that with Gary Oldman and Bram Stoker's Dracula up to a point. I'm not sure Gary Oldman really does extreme sexiness particularly well. No. But that's a very good performance, though.
It's incredible. Yeah, you're so right about that. And that's something that we talked about with Christopher Lee. I think that, he has even though he doesn't do much, he has quite a good balance of being quite charismatic and sexy whilst also being genuinely frightening. He doesn't really have to do much to do that, though, Christopher Lee, does he? And obviously, famously, I think he got quite annoyed at how little he got to do as Dracula as those films went on, right? He probably would have relished a chance to, do what Claes Bang got to do probably in the series, right? Where you get to do a lot more stuff, I suppose, as Dracula.
Yeah, I think with Christopher Lee, it was kind of an example of perfect casting. It's just sort of such snug casting that once they had him in place, that they were done, really. I mean, that was it. I think Peter Cushing is doing more of the heavy lifting in those films, but he's really good in them too.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about Dracula from 1979 then.
He has walked through centuries, untouched by time. He has seen empires rise and fall. He possesses the wisdom of the ages. Throughout eternity, no man has ever provoked such terrible fear and such haunting desire. Dracula, starring Frank Langella, with Laurence Olivier.
I am the last of my kind. descended from a conquering race. But I must warn you to take good care. If at any time my company does not please you, you will have only yourself to blame.
Oh, God! That's my poor Charlotte.
So usually, Tim, I would ask my guests to kind of give us a little brief plot overview, but it's a tricky one when we're basically doing the same story over and over again in this kind of series, right? But what is the kind of setup, and I guess how is this particular version of Dracula different to what we've seen or read so far?
Yeah, so I was going to say, well, there's this vampire.
Yeah.
He lives in Transylvania, except in this film, we never go there.
No.
It kind of cuts to, if you like, the chase. It cuts to the boat at the beginning. It cuts to him arriving in Whitby, and therefore cuts out the whole first act of the novel,
Yes.
which means that we don't get any of Jonathan Harker's journey into the mountains. And I'm immediately a little bit disappointed by that when I sit down to this.
That's usually most people's favourite section of the story, right? When we go to Transylvania with Jonathan and we go to the castle and all of that. That's kind of like, in most versions, that's the part we see and spend a lot of time with, isn't it? Yeah.
What I wonder is, because this version is adapted from a play,
Yes.
which was a vehicle for Frank Langella, and they decided to kind of port him over into the film. So it's kind of built around him. So they're like, if we can locate it all in Whitby and bring him in quickly and get him there, and then have this, kind of romance take place with bizarrely Lucy, but not Mina.
Yes.
It does all these flippings of the characters, which
It
are quite
does.
curious, I think. So Mina is the daughter of Van Helsing, and Lucy is the daughter of Dr. Seward, and neither of those are the case in the novel. So that's a weird. They've tried to bring it all into the family and kind of create more familial tensions and dynamics, but I'm not totally sure those decisions add very much. And in the case of Van Helsing, for example, he's not the veteran vampire hunter. He's just a grieving dad at a certain point. And that's Laurence Olivier, who I think is a little bit sort of overqualified, really, to be doing that. So there are some curious choices that were clearly made in the theatrical adaptation, which have been brought over here. But what I will say is this is a kind of meat and potatoes Hollywood version of Dracula that does certain things quite well. I really, for example, really like the opening credits. There's this kind of flyby shot of a kind of craggy castle or kind of forbidding mansion on top of a hillside in off Yorkshire, and the music and John Williams' score, which I'm sure we'll talk about, pipes up, and it's kind of dark and forbidding, and I'm into it.
Yes, you're right. It is a bit meat and potatoes. It doesn't necessarily give us anything that particularly bold on you compared to some of the other adaptations we've talked about so far. But I did enjoy it on the whole. I actually think this was a very watchable, fun version with some cool visuals and some quite fun performances as well. And obviously we'll talk about Frank Langella and some of the other performances in this movie. But you're right, this was based on the same stage play, actually, that the 1931 version was based on, starring Bela Lugosi. And obviously, this is Universal that made this film. So this is Universal's return to the monster that kind of made their studio a thing, right, in the early 30s. And they've gone back to Dracula, and they've gone back to the stage adaptation of Dracula. But they have made some changes. So whilst I think the stage play actually does have the first act in Transylvania, this version doesn't. It kind of streamlines the story even more. And I think maybe because of that, it does take away some of the more interesting elements, and it does feel, like you say, a bit meat and potatoes, a bit bog standard, I suppose.
It is, yeah. I mean, the main focus is on the kind of seductive, romantic qualities of Dracula in this. Frank Langella's performance he's probably the most urbane Dracula of all time. Even more so than Christopher Lee as most charming.
Yes.
He kind of smooths his way in and is sort of accepted in society until everything goes to shit.
Yeah, he might be the sexiest version of Dracula we've seen so far this series, I think. Langella himself, he said in interviews that he wanted to explore sides of the character of Dracula which hadn't been shown before. He said, "I decided that Dracula was a highly vulnerable and erotic man, not cool and detached, with no sense of humour or humanity. I didn't want him to appear stilted or authoritarian as he's often presented. I wanted to show a man who, while evil, was lonely and could fall in love." Right? So, and that is a different kind of Dracula to what we've seen with Christopher Lee, especially, right? This guy is the most overtly romantic and sexy, I would say. Right?
Absolutely right. There's a moment where he's kind of going in on Lucy's neck and decides, instead of bringing out the fangs, decides just to kiss her instead, which is quite a sexy moment. It's like he's sort of choosing sex over blood, if you like.
Yes.
And I thought that was an interesting thing, because usually the films tend to blur those two impulses, but it's almost like he's got this choice going on. But yeah, I'm not sure it finds a deeper soul to him or a deeper sense of melancholy or isolation, which is some of the things that Kinski does brilliantly in his one. But it is a very strong kind of turn, I think. I think Langella really holds the film together pretty well. I think the other real standout in the cast is actually Kate Nelligan, who plays Lucy. And they've decided that Lucy and Dracula are the ones who have the kind of really important kind of undying romance in this film, not Mina. Mina's dispensed with, actually. She's sort of like thrown under a bus in a way.
Yes.
Which very bizarrely is also the case in the Herzog one, but I don't know why they decided we don't like Mina. Let's bring Lucy up and give her more of a role.
Yeah.
But I think their relationship, it gives the film a kind of a core that it needs, because it's not as static or stagey as the 30s version, but it's based on a play, and it has some slightly post-Hammer qualities. I feel some of the extras and the supporting cast running around the place. There's a bit of a kind of hokey Hammerness going on.
Yeah. I completely agree. So let me, and I want to come to some of these elements again as we go, talk about the cast and everything. But I guess let me just start by talking about just the way this film kind of looks and feels. John Badham as a director, he had previously to this done Saturday Night Fever, right? A kind of weird, interesting. When I looked at his filmography and sort of what he's done post this as well, it's a kind of weird mix. He hadn't really done a lot of horror other than this, right? But what do you think of him as a director and the job he does with this film?
I think it's a workman-like job, and that's what you would come to expect from John Badham. You know, he became a kind of a bit of a specialist in action comedies after this. Things like Stakeout and War Games and so on.
Short Circuit as well. Random.
Exactly. I mean, this is definitely his his grisliest genre film, and it's surprisingly grisly at times. I think that's one way that they're bringing some changes here. I don't think he brings like a huge amount of vision to it. In fact, what I gather is that there are two versions of the film doing the rounds on home video with completely different color grading, for example.
That's right.
So the one I saw is very kind of bleached out, and I kind of liked how kind of almost monochrome it was at times.
Yeah.
And that seems to be kind of harking back to the 30s. But there's a much more punched up, saturated, colourful version as well. And he apparently is happy with both versions, which sort of makes you think. So you sort of pick a side, John. Which film are you making here exactly?
Yeah.
And again, the film does kind of work. It's an average retelling of Dracula that kind of works, but I think it lacks that ultimate kind of like the Coppola quality of kind of like deciding, right, this is the way I want to tell this story specifically, or indeed Herzog, or the other directors who've done it, or even Terence Fisher. I don't think it has that kind of driving directorial authority on it. It just has kind of solid work going on, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Like a little bit like you get the feeling is a kind of director for hire gig, I suppose, right? Something like that. But yeah, I did like the way it looks. I agree. I saw the same version of you, very kind of muted, almost monochrome. And actually having, spent so long watching all these Hammer films before this, it was actually quite nice to see something that it kind of looked a bit moody. And I kind of agree with you. I sort of miss the Transylvania section, but I did like the atmosphere of the way this movie kicked off with that, that shipwreck and that kind of foreboding. Everyone on the ship is dead. Dracula arrives in England, and I do think he created quite a good mood, at least at the beginning of that film.
Yeah, beginning and end, because it ends on a boat as well.
Yeah.
It's the most boat-bound version of the story there is, and I wonder if that's coming from the play as well. I wonder if they had kind of acts 1 and 3 on a boat kind of thing. But he does do pretty well with that, and it kind of punches up. It's sort of Dracula as action film at the end, the way that it kind of dispatches him. And that's John Badham can do that. It's well put together. I also like the asylum scenes because I think the desaturated version works for them.
Yeah,
just the kind of grimness and chaos of those scenes with Donald Pleasance running around as Dr. Seward, and the other inmates. You don't have those overly lurid colours that you maybe get in the kind of Hammer versions of this story. So I kind of think that works. Yeah, there's a lot in it where I'm kind of like tick tick tick, it's fine, but it just doesn't go over the top, does it? Really?
No, it doesn't. And yeah, I think you're right. And I think it was nice to see those those shots of like inside the kind of asylum with all the patients running. It does feel like it has a bit more going on in this than even the Hammer ones in that kind of true Hammer style. It looks stunning, it's great, but it is often like 2 or 3 people in drawing rooms and that kind of thing, with those, particularly the Terence Fisher ones. Obviously the same with Universal, so it's quite cool to see this slightly bigger scale, although like you say, still very much a stage play adaptation as well, so it sort of has to balance that, doesn't it, I think?
It's a bit more mobile than those films, and some of the set design's very good. The first time we go to Carfax, where he's kind of getting installed, and it's like all cobwebby and incredibly high Gothic chandeliers and everything, it's quite impressive. And then you realise, we're going to go back there quite a lot, and you sort of see the same set again repeatedly, and Renfield's there, and you start to realise, I see they really splashed out on that set, and they're going to make the most of it, which is fine. But yeah, I mean, we're kind of coming back to quite a static retelling when that happens, and you do miss the kind of like, the third act journey, not just the first act journey that we get in the novel and in the Coppola film, where they have to go back to find, to his home and sort him out. We missed that too. We're sort of stuck in Whitby the entire time. It's Whitby or on a boat perhaps.
And I guess, like you say, I'm sure this is partly the stage adaptation, the way it's been kind of pared down, but it does feel like a lot more streamlined, doesn't it? The way that they've removed certain characters, they've made certain characters related to each other, and it's a little bit more kind of like straightforward than the slightly more sprawling original novel, I suppose, and you sort of, when Laurence Olivier turns up about halfway through as Van Helsing, you're sort of like, oh great, well, Van Helsing, what a great character for him to play. And then you realise, oh no, this is not really the Van Helsing that we know. He knows nothing of vampire lore and has to kind of figure it out as he goes along, and is essentially there just to avenge the death of Mina. I mean, that's literally it. Yeah, Van Helsing has been a funny old character in various different adaptations, actually, because even revisiting the book, I kind of found him a little bit annoying in the book, actually. But Peter Cushing's Van Helsing is by far the best, I think, in all these versions so far. So speaking of, let's talk a little bit about the cast then. So first of all, Frank Langella, like you've mentioned him briefly already, but what do you think of him as an actor generally, and how what kind of Dracula he gives us in this film?
I like him in this. His dialogue can be a little bit on the stilted side. I think he's sort of, because he's sort of playing it urbane, and he's not playing it with a kind of accent over the top. So he's sort of smoothie Dracula, kind of convincing people to invite them into his homes. That's the vibe. And this was a big role for him, because he wasn't a huge film star really until this movie.
Well, I feel like I only know of him being a bit older. Do you know what I mean? Like, it was nice to see him so young.
He became famous for the villains he would play later on in stuff like Cutthroat Island and so on. But it was a big stage success for him. This, and I think probably the idea was, well, we'll give him a vehicle, and we'll build everything else around that, and it does work.
Yes,
I really like. I think he kind of cuts a very imposing figure, and I really like his costumes as well. The kind of cape that he wears, which has like bat wings coming out at the neck. It's really good. There's some good stuff there. I think the one thing he is missing though is that I don't find him frightening.
He's not scary. No,
that's a problem, I think, and it's you don't even sense that he's trying to be. He's sort of it's a commanding, authoritative turn without really being unsettling.
Totally. They've really gone the other extreme, haven't they, to the seductive side of Dracula, where you just go, I'd let him bite me.
Sure. He can nibble my earlobe any day.
Yeah, exactly. I love his look as well. Do you think this is very much a kind of... I've seen a few people talk about, that kind of very post... Saturday Night Fever, almost disco looking. He's got like a blow dry, and he's got his big collar and everything, but it's a good look. I agree with you. I think he's really compelling, and also there's a really interesting sort of there's a kind of hurdle that all filmmakers have to overcome with these adaptations, is that in the novel, Dracula basically disappears after the first act. Really, after Transylvania, he's sort of in the periphery. He kind of appears in the window at night every now and then or whatever, and we don't really see him again until he doesn't really talk again until the very end of the novel. So there's always that tricky thing of how do you bring your star back into the film and make them more present in the film adaptations, right? Which again, they definitely do with this. Frank Langella is in this movie throughout, isn't he? So yeah.
I mean, we haven't mentioned the kind of epistolary form of the book, which makes it kind of very back and forth in terms of the way the story is being told. And so any film adaptation either has a little bit of that, and sort of you see sort of Keanu Reeves scratching out some epistles to Winona Ryder or whatever, or decides to get rid of it altogether, which I think this film basically does. Right, there's really very little letter writing, so we've just kind of streamlined the story down and put it all in one place, which is kind of gives it a unity. But it also makes Dracula seem a little bit less all powerful and sort of all all encompassing, really. If he's basically he's just like, let me get to Whitby and that's where I'm going to plant myself and that's all I want to do. It's like, is that it? Yeah. So it limits his kind of stature, I think, a little bit to do that. It's more effective to have us kind of traveling through space or even time to find him.
Do you think because I think we'll talk about this with Nosferatu the Vampyre, won't we? That also that certain readings of Dracula that he's kind of tortured, right? That almost he wants to be dead, he wants to be at peace. Do you get that even from Frank Langella? Do you think that's coming across in this one?
I really don't. He feels like a man making the most of his undead afterlife, if you know what I mean. He's kind of like, he expresses very little melancholy or very little sense of pain, and I think that again is a limitation in this reading of it. And it's not Frank Langella's fault, because that is very much the way this film wanted to be told, the way this story wanted to be told in this version. But I do question whether it has enough scope, enough stature. It just feels like quite a limited read. So yeah, a bit disappointing on that level.
What about Donald Pleasance as Dr. Seward? Always goes for it with his performances, doesn't he?
He does. It's kind of fun having a Dr. Seward played by someone well known, bustling around, dealing with the asylum and so on. I think he makes a bit more of an impression in a way than Olivier. Because he's in it for more of the story.
And he's bigger, right? It's a bigger performance as well, which kind of suits it.
He is fun. You kind of need a certain amount of character and actor energy.
Yes.
In this film to kind of keep it kind of jollying along in a way. It's not my favourite Donald Pleasance performance. I think he can just sometimes just get a bit hammy, can't he?
Oh, massively. Especially when we hit this kind of era, like post Halloween, post Dr. Loomis, where he then just started doing just Halloween films and these kind of things. He kind of stops caring, I think, a little bit, doesn't he? But he's also quite enjoyable to watch in that regard in this movie.
I can't remember if it's him or which character it is when they get onto the ship at the end and they have to ask questions of the shipmates. And there's a very funny line where someone says, "Count Dracula is on this ship," and there's just like blank looks, and they go, "Nosferatu," blank looks, "Vampyre," blank looks, like let's try as many names as possible until they kind of go, yeah, oh, that guy, the guy in the coffin with the fangs, yeah, sure, we know who you're talking about now. But
so good. And then of course, Laurence Olivier, like what a name to have in this movie, right? Playing Van Helsing, like you say, kind of doesn't really come into it until about halfway through. He's a different kind of Van Helsing to the one we've seen previously. What do you think of him in this?
Well, I sort of wonder how they talked him into it, and
it's very odd.
He's just played a Nazi hunter in The Boys from Brazil, which was the year before this, and of course he played a Nazi in Marathon Man a few years earlier, but he was very ill at the time. This is, he had terminal cancer at this point in his career, Olivier. So how you lure him out of semi-retirement to come and play this role. He must have assumed, I wonder, if he was going to be playing the Van Helsing that we would want to see him play, but he doesn't. And it's just it's a frustrating choice for the character that he doesn't have any kind of backstory. He just turns up and is baffled and has to have everything explained to him and sort of figure out what a vampire is, if you like. I mean, he is fine, but it doesn't really deserve him. And I think they should probably have rethought the part and made it more substantial when he signed on. That's my feeling.
What do you think of the character of Lucy? Like you've already said, it's a good performance, and Lucy's always been quite an interesting, fun character, even though they've sort of done a bit of kind of switching of the characters in this. But Lucy as a character has always been that, I guess kind of slightly more sort of sexually liberated for a character of the time, right? And I guess a lot of this film is very much about her and that kind of desire, I suppose, to kind of, escape with Dracula and everything else.
Yeah, they have kind of flipped her and Mina, though, haven't they? Because Mina's the one who gets with Dracula first in this, so she's almost like the more the more liberated one, if you like. Whereas Lucy is the one who's got this courtship with Jonathan.
That's right.
So they flip them, but I actually think Kate Nelligan is one of the best things about this film. She kind of remains interesting, and she's doing good stuff right to the end when she's actually been infected herself, and she's kind of in the asylum going nuts. I think she keeps a really good handle on it. You buy into her enslavement, if you like, by Dracula, and also the kind of erotics of that she's kind of into it once it's happened. I think she is very good, actually, and kind of in a way becomes the second main character in the film, which is unusual, and I think quite effective.
Yeah, quite nice, actually. All of the men that very much take centre stage in the novel, particularly that kind of group of men of like Van Helsing and Dr. Seward and everyone else and Jonathan, they all sort of take a slight peripheral role in this one, don't they? And again, it spotlights on that kind of romance at the centre of it, I suppose. Yeah,
because they've kind of thrown Jonathan Harker a bit in the bin by cutting out his whole first act. Trevor Eve plays him, and he's completely fine, but a bit like, whatever.
A bit nothing.
It's a bit nothing. Yeah, and they bring him in at the end to kind of be part of the action finale slightly, only because they have to, because who else is going to fight? I mean, they've got Olivier and they've got Trevor Eve, and that's basically it, because Mina's dead and Lucy's a vampire. Yeah. So you're not going to have any of the women fighting Dracula at that point. So you have to have these men, and they do it on this boat in this quite effective kind of action sequence, actually, which I think is quite fun. The ending is fun, actually, isn't it? And quite gross. I like it. I like the way it ends. And there is a kind of like, and again, going back to that idea of that kind of romanticism, a kind of lushness about this, and I guess that's also reflected in the score, right? You mentioned this already, but what do you think of that? We've got John Williams, right, doing the score for this. What do you think of that score? I love the score. Yeah. So I heard a concert performance of a lot of John Williams' scores a few years ago, and I'd sort of forgotten about this one. And when it came on, and there's this kind of like aristocratic curlicue with the violins, and I was like, oh, that's the Dracula score, and I'd forgotten about it. It's like, it's really good. It's one of his more underrated scores, I think. And this would have been, a year after Superman and 2 years after Star Wars and so on. I mean, he was right in his pomp. Yes. And Universal got him for it. And I'm assuming that they kind of said, look at the history of Dracula scores and how good a lot of the earlier ones are. Here's your chance to put your stamp on it. And I think he really does. I think the score, the score is one of my favourite things about it. I'd probably more commonly listen to the score on its own than I would ever watch this film, really. And the score it doesn't really sound like a horror score either, right? John Williams is good at doing horror scores, as we know, but like this doesn't really sound like a horror score. It's true. It reminds me a little bit of the score for Private Life of Sherlock Holmes by Miklos Rosa, which has a similar like aristocratic violin, which suits the main character perfectly. And I think this, in this version, it's very well tailored to Frank Langella's kind of smoothie style. You've got this kind of seductive violin, kind of like with its curling melody, and it's sort of snaking its way in. It works very well. It does have some propulsion later on in the others, in the busier action scenes. It has, it kind of gets going too. But I think it's a very well, it's a bespoke score for this version of Dracula. And so the film itself, I don't think it really did particularly well, did it, when it first came out? And I wonder whether that's partly, like we've said, it's a kind of very meat and potatoes, quite, competently made and quite nice looking and sounding film, but that's kind of it, right? And especially after the 70s, there were a lot of Dracula movies, there were a lot of interesting vampire movies, and slightly more weird, like Nosferatu the Vampyre, which we're going to talk about, but also movies like Martin, Let's Scare Jessica to Death, or Blackula, these like weirder, more modern, 70s twists. And I suppose this is just a little bit more your traditional It's
adaptation.
Very trad. It's very trad, and in the late 70s, trad was not what people were really after.
No.
I think it did perfectly fine. It got decent reviews. It made its money back. Everyone praised Frank Langella. Right. But that was sort of it. It didn't have much of an afterlife. And it didn't excite people. It wasn't a revolution in terms of the telling of the story. It didn't reinvent Dracula in any significant way. And in making him kind of the most romantic version of himself, in a way, was even more of a throwback. I mean, even more of a kind of, in a way, conservative version. The only thing is that there are some grisly bits. I mean, there are some kind of a lot of close-ups on neck wounds and so on. There's some like Universal allowed John Badham to kind of go a little bit push those buttons slightly. But in terms of the conception of Dracula, the non-frightening conception of him, I think just made the film feel a little bit sort of safe and pedestrian.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you think over time, because it does feel like, I spoke to a few people, particularly women who I know, who have said, oh, are you going to cover the Frank Langella one? I love that one. And I wonder whether it's starting to be, maybe in a similar way to the Gary Oldman film, it's starting to be reappraised as like a bit of a almost sort of camp classic or something. I don't know. Do you think it pushes that far enough for it to be that sort of movie where now we can kind of look back on it and kind of enjoy it in that sort of way? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I kind of wish it were more in that vein. I mean, because obviously his sort of romantic scenes with Kate Nelligan are quite intense. In fact, we haven't mentioned the trippy bit where they kind of get together.
Oh, I love that.
Which is almost like a James Bond title sequence, except if it were Dracula instead of James Bond.
With the bats.
And there's these bats flapping, and it goes very kaleidoscopic and very trippy. And actually, it's probably my favourite bit in the whole film.
Definitely.
That's great.
Yeah.
But fine. So he's doing all of that. At the same time, he is also taking charge of Renfield and his castle. And if the film wanted to get some camp classic points, it could just make that seduction as interesting. It could actually make his kind of, if you like, gay seduction of Renfield work. And instead, it's just too nervous to do that. So it just makes it quite professional between them. It's like, that's all you get. There's one bit where he kind of swoops his cape around the back of Renfield and sort of takes him under his wing slightly, but that's all you get. So little hints of it. But I think, it needed a bolder sensibility to kind of make that, to give that an afterlife. I mean, I think it's a decent version. I don't want to crap on it. And I think obviously, people like it as a trad retelling. But it just doesn't have that excitement value.
Yeah, it's true. And you're right about that kind of, that's another thing we've talked about a lot with the various adaptations and even the novel, right? There is a kind of there is a sort of queer element to Dracula in that regard. And I guess just vampires in general, they're very much associated with that, aren't they? As characters, pansexual almost vampires. And that's always been there ever since the Bram Stoker novel, I think.
100%. And by cutting out the first act, they eliminate so much of that immediately. Because Jonathan Harker's arrival at the castle, really well done in the Coppola film. Gary Oldman's, if you like, kind of seduction of Keanu Reeves, wining and dining him and so on, is really skillful. And even though Keanu Reeves, obviously, we don't want him to speak in that film, when he's not speaking, he is beautiful in it, and it kind of like works, and the kind of erotics of that work quite well. There's no such equivalent here.
No,
there's nothing between Trevor Eve and Dracula really.
No,
there's a bit of jealousy about what's going on with Lucy. That's it. It's a matter of jealousy. There's not much else. So they miss a trick there, I think, and it's disappointing in the late 70s to see them missing that trick.
Yes, when you think there's actually more there in the original Hammer movie. Even we talked about that moment with Christopher Lee where Jonathan is kind of approached by the vampire bride, and then he kind of goes, he's mine and stuff. Like you say, we don't even get any of that in this, and there is he's all about the women in this, isn't he? From that moment he enters that dinner party at the beginning and he kind of locks eyes with the two women, it's like that's his focus.
He's basically movie. Dracula the player.
Yes, the player. Exactly that. So finally, I guess, how does this movie hold up for you? Sort of, it's now 30 plus years old. How does it sort of, or 40 plus years old? How does it kind of hold up for you in 2022?
Well, it's less creaky than you might assume, given its kind of vintage, and given its relatively minor reputation, I suppose, among all the other Draculas. Yeah. So it has its merits, but I do think, as we've sort of discussed, it's just lacking in a lot of ways.
Yes.
It's a little bit flat and a little bit compromised. It doesn't have that much imagery that really sticks with you. It has a kind of decently assembled atmosphere, which everyone's worked hard to kind of create. The sense of period is fine, sure, but it lacks moments of really kind of vivid visionary excess, except for the trippy seduction, which I think is great. Yes. If they'd just gone down more in that vein, if they'd maybe done slightly more drugs during the post-production and just gone, right, let's just go all out and do more of that.
Yes.
And I kind of like some of the transformations of the Count into like a wolf or a bat or whatever. The kind of moments where he jumps through a window and turns into a wolf are quite well pulled off. There are good little moments here and there. But as a whole tapestry, it doesn't really satisfy me that much. It's kind of it's a fun watch every 20 years, but you're not going to want to go back to it more often than that.
You're right, and I think particularly as that kind of like romantic Dracula, it feels like it's sort of Francis Ford Coppola's version kind of did this but better, didn't it? That's the thing. I think that's maybe why this one is sort of the slightly forgotten one in the middle, almost.
It is. You would love it to be the missing link, but
yes.
It's sort of it goes missing on itself in a weird way. It's just not. It
Yeah.
doesn't do enough to be the missing link. It's sort of, you can just remove it, and then you've got the various retellings of Dracula make perfect sense in terms of the way each one of them tells the story. Mm-hmm. This one doesn't add very much, or sort of say very much about why it was made then and by whom. It's a little bit anonymous, I guess, is the thing.
Yeah, and I guess it goes back to that idea of kind of, studio Hollywood film. It feels like it's playing to the widest audience, I suppose, in that regard, doesn't it? Yeah.
Don't cry. I can see it up there. Look. It's very high. That's all right. I can climb up.
Twit you. Twit you.
Hello, Wise Owl. Hello, Wise Owl.
Twit you. Only a fool would climb up there. Didn't you see the warning sign? Pylons kill. Stay away from them.
If you are of a certain generation, especially in the UK, you might remember the creepy sort of public information videos from the 70s and 80s where, like the clip you just heard there, you'd get somebody kind of warning children not to climb up on pylons or not to play near a quarry, and these kind of scenarios always ended in death in some way, and I think they traumatized a generation of children. Anyway, that clip you just heard there was actually from the latest episode of Inside Number 9, in which they take that idea of the public information video from the 70s and they turn it into an incredibly dark horror story. And that's a little snippet of one of the things we're going to be discussing on Patreon next week, because I was joined by friend of the pod, Adam Robinson, and we discussed the latest season of the brilliant British horror anthology show Inside Number 9 in depth. So they've just finished their 7th season on the BBC, 6 brand new episodes, one of which was from the clip you just heard there, Wise Owl. And there are a whole bunch of other brilliant episodes as well. So Adam and I sat down and we discussed every single one of those episodes. It was a really fun discussion to have, and there were a lot of really interesting stories in this particular season. So as well as going through each of them, we also finished by ranking all 6 episodes from our favourite to our least favourite. So if you want to check that out, you simply need to sign up to our Patreon at a $5 level. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. Meanwhile, for $10 patrons this week, we finished our Jurassic retrospective by reviewing Jurassic World Dominion, which is of course the latest and apparently the last film in the Jurassic World franchise, which is out in cinemas obviously this week. It wasn't great, sadly, but it was a very fun discussion. So that is available for $10 patrons. So if you want to sign up, you'll get access to various different bonus treats depending on what tier you sign up to. And if you sign up at a $20 level, you'll get access to absolutely everything. Plus, it will make you an official Evolution of Horror sponsor. So head on over to patreon.com/evolution of horror. Everybody who signs up, no matter what tier, will also get a very special shout out on the podcast as a thank you. So speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of May a very special thanks. So a big thank you to Sarah Gray, Julia, Christopher Blaze, CJ Swanson, Michael Hanley, Terry Woods, Chris Hindle, Monica Berryman, Sean Darcy, David Price, Emma Highmore, Habib Ali Habib, Sam Morgan Russell, Bridget Lippert, Brian Robinson, Lauren Gallagher, Julian Graham, John Featonby, Jessica Jazz, Renee D, Joel McKeever, Harold Hoss, Esme, Audrey, Kristen, Alexandra Bamford, Vicky Gus, Adam Lucas, Jeffrey Harrison, Louis Cazares, Robert Finnegan, CS, Jesse Karp, Megan, Oliver Plunkett, Justin Burton, Sarah Grace, NH, Katie Marks, James Hart, Sophie Bender-Johnston, Julia Garcia, Grace Smith, and Omar Idleby. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up. And if you want to join them and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, in just a moment, we're going to get into the second half of this week's episode in which Tim Robey and I discuss Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampyre. But actually, first of all, just a quick announcement. If you haven't already seen it on our newsletter, on Tuesday, the 21st of June, that's this Tuesday coming up, here in London, I'm going to be hosting a very special 100th anniversary screening of Nosferatu. It's going to be screened in one of the oldest and most beautiful cinemas in London, the Regent Street Cinema. The cinema itself opened 2 years before Nosferatu even came out, so the cinema itself is over 100 years old, so it's a perfect venue. Not only that, the film is also going to be accompanied by a live organ score as well. So there's going to be some live music throughout it. And not only that, there's going to be a very special panel discussion after the film in which I am going to be joined by silent film expert Pamela Hutchinson, actor and writer, and of course vintage movie expert and friend of the pod James Swanton, and all-round legend when it comes to vampire movies and horror, Kim Newman. So me, Kim Newman, Pamela Hutchinson and James Swanton are going to discuss the film in front of a live audience right there after the film. So it's going to be a really special evening. Please grab yourself a ticket if you can. So that's going to be on Tuesday, the 21st of June, from 8 p.m. at the Regent Street Cinema in London. And I will link to the ticket page in the show notes. Okay, speaking of Nosferatu then, let's head into the second half of this week's episode in which Tim Robey and I discuss all things Nosferatu the Vampyre from 1979.
Well, this is traditionally one of my favourite versions of Dracula. This is the Werner Herzog version, which is a remake in part of the 1922 F.W. Murnau version, starring Max Schreck. So it kind of partly remakes that film, but also goes back to the novel in various ways.
Yes.
Clearly, it's Herzog sort of doing a bit of both. And it came at the end of Herzog's pretty remarkable run of 1970s films, including stuff like, obviously The Enigma of Caspar Hauser and Aguirre, Wrath of God, and many of his other films, Strozek and all these other ones. He had a good budget to play with, and he gets some incredibly good location photography out of this film, which is one of the great assets of it. It stars Klaus Kinski, his very regular collaborator, as the most ghastly, ghoulish, pale, fanged version of the character ever. Absolutely a contrast in every way from the kind of dapper, urbane Frank Langella. This is a monster rotting away before our eyes, if you like. And Isabella Gianni is his sort of antagonist, I guess, in a way, slash intended paramour. Again, Lucy, not Mina. So they've decided that Lucy is the one for Dracula, not Mina. And quite a substantial role for Bruno Ganz as Jonathan Harker. And we get we were just talking about having missed it in the previous film, we get, in the most spectacular way, the first act, with Bruno Ganz travelling through into Carpathia and being kind of shepherded to the door of the Count, and then the whole story then can unfold from there. And when you watch that, in fact, I'm glad I watched the films in this order.
Yes.
Badham first and then Herzog, because you realise how much you really need that part of the story for it to have the kind of scope and the romanticism that you want, a kind of capital R romanticism in the kind of German way that you want it to have. And cutting away that bit really does some damage, I think, to the story.
Yeah. So what do you think of this one, Tim? You mentioned this is one of your faves, is it?
It really is. I love the aura and the atmosphere of this film so much. It's such a strange delve into the mythos of Dracula, but also into the mind of Herzog and the kind of the different resonances that he gets from the story that no other director has got. The kind of strange, it begins with these bizarre images of like cadavers in the catacombs, with this Popol music, kind of incredibly eerie atonal score laid over the top, and you just immediately have an evocation of kind of evil and decay, which is exactly where you want to be when you're watching Dracula. You know, you want to kind of feel shivers and shudders and like what is coming down the pike here. So it starts off really brilliantly. I will say, I haven't seen it for quite a number of years. All my favourite stuff in the film is kind of in the first hour. I'm gonna admit. I think there are some sort of missteps towards the end, but there's just such an extraordinary atmosphere to it for most of the running time that I'll always value it for that reason.
It really does capture the sort of otherworldly quality of even the original Nosferatu, and then it kind of gives it even more so than that, doesn't it? It is like, I loved it. This was only the second time I'd ever seen it, and I forgot how eerie and weird this film is. And like you say, especially after watching it straight after the Badham one, it's like, whoa, this is like, we're really in another universe here. It's almost hard to believe they were made in the same year in a way, right?
It's crazy. And and also, we should actually say this was also the same year as Salem's Lot, the TV version of Stephen King's famous vampire novel. And the other thing that popped into my head while watching this version is the journey that Jonathan Harker makes into the heart of darkness, through the mountains towards the Forbidden Castle, and then to find the bald dome of the horrific Dracula figure here. It's Apocalypse Now. I mean, it's the same story in a way. It's Willard going upriver to find Kurtz. And the scenes and the kind of amount of time that the film spends just with those two characters, with Harker and Dracula, is really substantial here, and I think worth it. It's worth dwelling on their scenes together as long as this does, and not just kind of trying to crack through them as quickly as possible. Which obviously Badham skips them altogether, but even some of the other versions sort of try and get this bit out of the way because they want to get to the sexy stuff with the women.
Absolutely.
But in fact, some of the stuff with Harker is some of the best stuff, I think.
Absolutely, it really is. It's so eerie, this film, from the opening. Like you say, like one of the creepiest opening title sequences ever. I love it so much. I guess I want to start off by asking you a bit about Werner Herzog. I mean, this is the first time, I think, on this podcast that we've ever covered anything by Werner Herzog. So I guess I just want to start off by asking you a bit about, for people that maybe don't know too much about him and his work, sort of how would you describe Herzog as a director and the kind of film he makes, I suppose?
Well, yeah, he's one of the, let's just set him up a bit, he's one of the leading lights of the new German cinema that emerged in the 1970s. There was him, Fassbinder and Wim Wenders were the main ones, and Volker Schlondorf. How do you single out Herzog from them? I guess the obsessions of Herzog tend to be with the ends of the earth. He wants to go to the very end of the earth and find the weirdest, most kind of godforsaken corners of the planet to look at. And most of his films take you there in some way. You know, Agri Wrath of God, his exploration tale, takes you into the heart of the jungle. And into the absolute disaster of that expedition. Fitzcarraldo is about this kind of doomed attempt to carry a steamer ship across a mountain to create an opera house. There's usually some sort of sense of great challenge, some great adventure, some great peril, and a great disaster awaiting on the cliff edge, if you like. And this is exactly his take on Dracula. He sort of he takes us right in. He finds the kind of creepiest mountain he can find, and in the middle of Europe. And then he sets about making Jonathan Harker go there, and he kind of gives us that journey. But he has many other obsessions and interests as well. He's sort of inimitable in his way, Herzog. But his sort of questing obsession with finding the weirdest bits of human civilization, or the most crumbled, almost kind of non-existent fragments of civilization left in some corner of the earth. That is, for me, that will always be kind of Herzog's kind of main theme.
Absolutely. And even a kind of since you use the phrase, you've talked about Heart of Darkness, because there's something about his I don't know, I always feel like he's kind of, there's that famous idea of him, staring into the abyss. There's that element to his work as well, isn't there? The kind of darker side of humanity or nature or the world and that kind of thing.
Absolutely, staring into the abyss, and the abyss is staring back. And his interest in madness, not just darkness, but madness. And so, of course, Dracula lends itself to that, because so many of the characters involved, especially in this version, just simply go mad. It's even the ones who have not even been infected go mad. There's one scene where Isabella Gianni says, "Shall we just all wear straitjackets now? Because we've all gone crazy." It's like the inmates have taken over the asylum. But It's his obsession with madness is very interesting. And a lot of his 70s main characters are either megalomaniacs, often played by Klaus Kinski in Aguirre or Fitzcarraldo or whatever. They're either that or they are outcasts who have to be kind of put away in asylums. Someone like Wojak or whatever. And this film has both of those. It has Renfield, who's this giggling estate agent. It's the silliest.
So much giggling.
The silliest mad. I mean, he's completely mad before he goes mad, but you can kind of see where the madness comes from. He's Jonathan Harker's boss in this version, and then becomes Dracula's kind of little lackey, if you like, as usual, and starts nibbling on those insects and so on. But yeah, the madness theme is very much part of this. And then there's the kind of weird forlorn romanticism. I mean, you don't really turn to Herzog for a kind of a conventional love story. It's not something that often happens. But what I do find interesting about the Isabella Gianni character here is that she's the first character we see. She kind of wakes up in bed screaming with this vision of a bat coming through. And she's already so pale. It's almost like, are you a vampire?
Yes.
What is going on? Have you been infected? And she has some sort of psychic connection with Dracula, which is made clear, which is obviously comes from the book as well. And yet she rejects his advances. There's a lot of complicated stuff going on with her. I think maybe the film doesn't quite know what to do with her right at the end. I think it gets a little bit confused. But there's something very interesting about Herzog finding this umbilical cord between them right at the start that means that she almost looks like she's been infected before they've even met.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's cleverly taking from both Nosferatu and the novel here. Because obviously, famously Nosferatu was this kind of a legal adaptation of Dracula, which, obviously then Stoker's widow sued them and prints were destroyed and everything. But for that original Nosferatu, for those reasons, they changed character names and that kind of thing, whereas this time Herzog has kind of taken Nosferatu, but also he's been able to actually call, Count Orlok Dracula and, Ellen Lucy and all of this. And so he's kind of taken elements from both, but that element does seem to come from the Nosferatu, that connection between Lucy and him. And not quite knowing whether she's attracted to him because he's so monstrous and kind of pathetic in this as well. And it's like, is she actually kind of luring him into her bedroom in that final moment of the film, or is something else going on there? It
feels like I do like that scene at the end. It's almost like a honey trap that she's set in order to kind of claim him, and it's a self-sacrifice at the same time. That's effective, but for me, their earlier encounter when they meet for the first time is one of the weaker scenes because it's so talky. They kind of just stand there and talk to each other, and he tries to explain how difficult it is being undead, and she's like, get over it, mate. Like, I am not falling for this routine kind of thing, except they say it in these very kind of ponderous tones.
Will you come to me and be my ally? That be salvation for your husband. And for me, the absence of love is the most abject pain.
Salvation comes from ourselves alone. And you may rest assured that even the unthinkable will not deter me.
I watched the English dub of the film, which I don't think I'd seen before. Because they shot both versions. They shot it with the actors speaking English and German.
That's
and
right.
Some of the actors were dubbed in English rather than speaking it themselves. And it's one of the weird cases where I actually really like the English version.
It's weird.
It's so strange because I think German accented English has such a particular ring to our ear, and it does have a sinister quality. It suits the story really well.
Yes.
We're used to the way Herzog himself sounds, perhaps, because we've heard him narrate his documentaries.
That's right.
And we've got with both not only Klaus Kinski but also Bruno Ganz, two of the most celebrated German actors of all time, reading in their quite kind of familiar to us English tones. It really works, I think. When they're sat around the dining table in Transylvania, having their first conversations, it's that scene is tremendous. And you get to hear Kinski say "Children of the Night" in his voice, which is great, and I will take that over, in fact, him saying it in German.
That's really interesting. You're right, and there is a kind of sort of uncanny quality to it with that dubbing and that kind of thing as well. It's a very strange thing. Yeah, and you're right, about Herzog. I think the first movies of Herzog's I saw were probably documentaries, but there is also that feeling of, like you say, even his kind of narrative films, there's this feeling like he is out there on the far edges of the world shooting stuff as well, right? Like there are documentaries about even making some of his movies, right? Because of how tough his shoots were and that kind of thing. And there is that feeling in this too, that it doesn't feel like we're in a soundstage ever, in this movie. Everything feels quite authentic.
Totally. The location shooting is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, as you say, there are whole documentaries not only about the physical challenges of making a film like Fitzcarraldo, called Burden of Dreams, which was just such a nightmare shoot on so many levels, to actually essentially do what the main character is trying to do.
Push a boat up a mountain.
And just finding the right place to do that. But not only that, but the challenges he faced with Klaus Kinski, his constant collaborator and absolute nemesis.
Yes.
My Best Fiend is the name of another documentary, which is purely about his relationship with Klaus Kinski.
I'm desperate to see this. I haven't been able to track that documentary down.
Film, yeah. And he cast him again and again just because he was so reliably brilliant, but he was a total nightmare to work with.
Yes.
But he gets one of Kinski's best performances in this film, I think. What I particularly love is the loneliness of the character that obviously Herzog is drawn to. The loneliness of being undead and immortal and unable to die and stuck up in a castle with no one there, only the wolves howling around you for company.
Yes.
And he expresses that quite concretely several times in the film. He's like, it's a living death.
Yes.
It's the ultimate condition of solitude. So I think that's what draws Herzog to the character more than anything else. Is that because he's always looking for the ultimate expressions of human solitude, and alienation and isolation.
Yes.
And he gets all of those in Dracula.
Yeah, Kinski then, he had this reputation, didn't he, as being like an absolute monster on set, right? Is that right? And this is, by this point, Nosferatu, he had already collaborated with Herzog a handful of times at this point, hadn't he? So
yeah, they hadn't done Fitzcarraldo yet. That was a couple of years later, and that's the one where they nearly killed each other on the set of the film. But yeah, he was just the most difficult acting collaborator possible in terms of his demands whenever he turned up. And I mean, I can't imagine how happy he was about the amount of makeup he would have had to wear on every day of this shoot, because he looks so transformed.
Yes.
That's one of the main borrowings from the 20s film is the kind of the weird sort of incredibly kind of sinister, wizened quality that Dracula has here, with his incredibly long fingernails, which are used very effectively in shadow.
So good.
And his extraordinary pallor, and his incredibly red lips, and then these two very sharp fangs, which seem to be his only teeth.
Yes.
Which looks very strange.
Yeah.
And I mean, really uncanny and very odd. But yeah, can you imagine strapping Kinski into that makeup chair every day? And he would have been going out of his mind, I imagine.
Yes. But you don't get that impression watching the film, right? He's calm, he's quiet. I mean, he's creepy. There's something about this version, because even the original 1922 Nosferatu, Max Schreck, he was incredibly creepy, but more overtly monstrous in the way he performed it. Whereas there's something, he's kind of pathetic in this, isn't he? But in a way that I find him even more uncomfortable to spend time with, because he's just like, oh, you just want to get the hell away from him at all times.
He is pathetic. He almost like splits the difference between Max Schreck in Nosferatu and Peter Lorre in M.
Yes.
There's a sense of him being this outcast figure, which society does not want to touch.
Yes.
And the second that his name is mentioned in the little Romany village at the beginning, there's like everyone kind of goes, don't go anywhere near that guy.
Yeah.
He is a pathetic outcast, and it sort of tries to sell us on the idea that he's going to find his life partner forever, his partner in undeath, and that will be Lucy. And I think we're perhaps led to believe that she might go along for the ride.
Yes.
Based on Ajani's early scenes in the film, she seems to be prepared for that to happen. And then when she rejects him, it's quite a harsh moment in the film, I feel. Because it's a scene where you can sort of imagine him slightly seducing her, and certainly, Frank Langella would probably have achieved that.
Yes.
But he is too hideous to succeed. So he's left feeling even more isolated. So it is kind of quite a powerful rupture, that. And then she becomes his primary antagonist. No one else is really interested in taking him down except for her. She tries to get Van Helsing's help. Van Helsing in this film is enfeebled and just doesn't do anything, and just sort of says, science says this can't exist. He's almost the opposite of himself in the novel. So she can't get any help from him, so she just has to kind of figure out a plan herself, which becomes essentially honey trapping him into her boudoir just before dawn and keeping him there long enough for the light to flood in. And that really great sequence right at the end.
Incredible. And even that sequence, right, he just looks so pathetic. That final shot of him just kind of crumpled in the corner of the bedroom and everything.
Exactly. Just curled up.
There's something kind of sort of sickly about him, isn't there? Obviously, there's all these connections to the plague and rats and disease. Like, there's just this. He's just somebody you wouldn't want to be stuck in a room with for multiple reasons, isn't he? I think
totally, And it becomes a kind of weird social plague when he arrives.
Yes.
In what they call Whitby in this film. It's like Wisbon or something.
Yes.
It's like they've transformed it. Herzog brought 11,000 rats to the set.
Oh my God, all the rats.
Just had them running rampant, and the town just becomes deeply infected, and all of these coffins are brought out. And in a way, Nosferatu himself is not really in charge of any of that. It's just sort of going on around him. It's just this almost like the bubonic plague that is being spread out from his arrival onwards. But there are some odd moments in that last act, though. I don't know. I find the ending a little unsatisfactory. Not what Lucy does, but what happens afterwards when they try and arrest Van Helsing. There's this very silly scene with the policeman. It's extremely silly. Which goes on for like a minute, and they're like, "You can't arrest me. I haven't done anything. You've killed a man. We've got the bloody thing." And he's like, it's a very odd scene to put right at the end of your movie when you sort of feel as though the film wants to be summing itself up. And it also does this thing where Bruno Ganz becomes like the next Dracula. He's been infected, and he's been sitting in a corner of the living room with some sort of garlicky dust around him, whatever it's supposed to be, and then he's finally escapes, and then you see that he's got the fangs, and he kind of rides off, and he's like, right, I'm next. It's a bit silly. I mean, it doesn't quite have the gravity that you want this film to end with.
Very strange. It's not in keeping with the rest of the film, is it? I almost wondered whether that was a nod to the Universal movies, because Universal 1931 Dracula ends with Van Helsing killing Dracula, and then there is a sequel to it in the 1930s, Dracula's Daughter, and that begins exactly where the previous one left off, and Van Helsing is arrested by the police for killing this man, shoving a wooden stake through his heart. And it's a kind of comedy moment with these two bumbling cops being like, "Come on, matey, you're going downtown," and all this, and it's fine and it's silly for like a Universal monster movie. But I was like, that's weird that Werner Herzog essentially has put that scene at the end of this film, and it's very strange.
It's especially odd given that Van Helsing has not been a major player until the moment where he comes in and Dracula is already crumpled in the corner, kind of ravaged, and he's like, well, I'll just shove a stake in to finish the job. And then he gets then they make this big meal out of arresting him, and you're a bit like, why are we focusing on you now?
It's not necessary, especially because it's so clean the way that the original Nosferatu ends, with basically him dissolving into the sunlight, and I think Lucy dies in the bed at that point, and then it just ends, and it was like, it's a lovely, I think Kim Newman described that film as a kind of sketch of Bram Stoker's novel, and it works so well with all of the stuff that they've kind of cut out of it, and just relying on those visuals. Weird choice that Werner Herzog, considering he loves the original, he says it's one of his favourite films, that's why he remade it, right? That he chose to make certain changes like that.
It's an odd call right at the end, but we won't let it bother us too much, because there's so much else going on.
Some of that other imagery, that weird moment where going back to the rats, where you see a bunch of people having like a kind of feast, like a dinner party at a table, and then it dissolves into all of the rats crawling around that like weird imagery like that. I kind of loved it.
There's some brilliant dissolves in it, and it's just as good at daylight horror as it is at nocturnal horror, this film. I mean, there's some brilliant nighttime scenes, especially in the Transylvanian bits, but then the rats just running around in daylight, and Ajani trying to come through the town square and people trying to grab her as she runs through. It's really great. He kind of makes daylight just as eerie and unsettling, really, as the dark.
Yeah, I was going to say, to ask like a basic question, is this scary, this film? Do you find it scary?
I do. I certainly did. The first time I ever saw it, I was like freaked out by it.
Me
I was
too.
Like, really, I think I probably watched it late at night and, you know, on the telly. And I was like, that it's hard not to be pulled into that kind of aura of evil at the beginning. And just like think, where are we heading?
Just incredibly creepy, isn't it?
And the use of, I mean, the music is really, really good as well. Popova did the score, but there's little fragments of Wagner that come in, which kind of give it the properly questy feel that you know Herzog wants it to have.
Yeah.
As he's riding up the kind of circuitous paths up the mountains and so on. And I do find it scary until the finale, which is it gets a little bit cumbersome. I think most of the film's dialogue is sort of in the last half hour as well.
Yes.
It's like there's not very much dialogue in this film, but
no. Again, it almost works as that kind of silent movie, doesn't it? Definitely.
There's an incredible shot of Kinski standing outside, and you can tell that dawn is not very far away, and you're sort of he's standing there, and it's almost like he's testing his own limitations. He's sort of like he's aware that, you know, daylight is his ultimate nemesis and will tear him to shreds, but he's just standing there waiting.
Yes.
And you're like, are you waiting for dawn to arrive? What is going on? And he has this, you can sense these dilemmas going on inside him, which are exactly the dimensions that I think the Frank Langella one is missing.
Totally.
He has doubts, he has insecurities, he has a sort of sense of total rejection by everyone around him. That I find sort of chilling, without it being exactly frightening, but yeah.
Do you think that queer element is kind of back in this movie? Like we said, it was kind of absent from the Langella version.
It is because of the stuff with Harker at the beginning. You only miss the actual neck, the kiss on the neck. You don't see it happen.
Yes.
You see the puncture marks afterwards.
Yes.
But I wish they'd gone there, because I think that would have been good.
It's creepy when he creeps into his room at night, you know, and he's there in the shadows in the doorway, you know. It's a great moment.
Absolutely,
yeah. You're right. And there is that kind of, there's that sadness, there's that tortured element to him in this, isn't there? There's a line where he says something like, the absence of love is the most abject pain, or something like that. And there is this feeling, again, just kind of sad and slightly pathetic, this vampire, isn't he?
Totally.
Really interesting.
And I think he is paving the way. This one isn't even a missing link, it's an actual link, because it is paving the way for the Coppola one, and for the way that Gary Oldman relates to Mina in that film, and obviously the addition that Coppola made to it, Vlad the Impaler stuff at the beginning, the idea that this love has kind of travelled across centuries and left him feeling like the loneliest man in the world, because his sweetheart has gone. All of those emotions seem to be slightly prefigured, I think, in what Kinski is doing. And the moment where he sees Lucy's photograph in this film and decides that he has to come over and find her. I just wish that first scene with Ajani was perhaps a silent scene. I wish that they, sized each other up without immediately talking in this kind of highfalutin way about their respective crises, because it just feels... It feels kind of almost like a scene out of an opera. But one of the spoken scenes in the middle, where you're a bit like, can we just get to the next bit? Can we get to the next really good song?
You're right. Yeah. What do you think of Isabelle Adjani in this? I mean, we've previously on this podcast talked about Possession. Such a kind of huge, kind of hysterical almost performance in that, right? And in this, she's so kind of still in comparison, isn't she?
She's very still, but she's sort of she's unsettling. I mean, you're creeped out by her at the beginning, I think. She is not a sort of image of wholesomeness.
No.
She almost looks like Elvira. And you're sort of like, you would be a natural corpse bride, basically, is the way I sort of look at her through a lot of the film. So it is a surprise when she sort of says, no, Jonathan is my true love, and I'm not going to go along with your plans, Mr. Drac. And then she decides to turn against him. That's an interesting pivot, that moment. I like her in it a lot. I think she's sort of suitably intense to the end. and she's good. And I think Bruno Ganz is really good too. He's actually one of the best Jonathan Harkers ever.
Yes, he's very good.
He's in those early scenes. He carries the film for like a whole half an hour. Well, we've left Ajani behind, and we haven't met Kinski yet. It's just him really.
Yeah.
And I like him a lot. He then ends up sat in a corner, looking very, very grey, and has his worst scene is his very last scene, but that's fine.
No, I agree. I think it's all of them are great. All of them do their job very well, I think, in this kind of very weird, uncanny kind of vibe that this movie gets across. So there you go. Anything else you want to mention on this movie? Any other particular highlights for you in this film, or anything worth talking about?
The cuckoo clock.
Oh my God, the
creepiest cuckoo clock in the history of cinema. When Harker gets to the castle and they're sat at the table, and suddenly you see this skull, the lid of this skull pops up, and out comes this clock, and then a little skeleton comes out of it and does a little dance out of the front while it's chiming, and then the skeleton pops back in, and then the skull just flaps back with this kind of horrible kind of wet click. And you're like, yep, okay, fine. Where the hell did you find that, Werner? Did you get someone to make that for you? Did you buy it in some, antique shop in Cluj or somewhere? I don't know. Like, where did you dig that thing up?
I want that clock.
It's incredible. I wonder who owns it now. Yeah.
Well, that's what it is about this film, isn't it? It's those little details. It's the locations. It's the rats. It's the props. It's the costume. Like, every element is so eerie and weird.
Totally. And that shot also of the bat crawling up the curtains. That's a very good moment when we're in Ajani's like bedchamber and there's this bat crawling up.
Just those moments when Ajani's just having to like step over all the rats. You just think, this must have not been a very fun film to make as well.
I can't imagine how they managed to keep charge of those 11,000 rats as they were running around. I mean, the logistics of that.
Horrible.
Good Lord.
Horrible. There you go. And to wrap up, how do you think this movie kind of holds up? Like we said, came out the same year as Badham's Dracula. How does this movie kind of hold up today in comparison?
I think this is one for the ages.
Yeah.
Despite its faulty ending.
Yeah.
But you just leave that to one side. There's just so much extraordinary imagery. The aura of it is so immense. It feels vast.
Yes.
And it feels kind of timeless in that way.
Yeah.
And I think it achieves pretty much everything. It achieves everything that Herzog wanted it to achieve within an hour. Yeah. And that it's done, essentially. And then it's a bit like it sort of trails away, but everything, the job has been done. He has reconfigured the character and the story in his own head, and projected it incredibly vividly and creepily. And there's stuff in it that just stays with you forever, I think.
And if you were to recommend people to check out other Herzog films off the back of this, where should they start? What are good kind of like first stepping stones for Herzog's career?
I reckon definitely Aguirre Wrath of God is a really good first stepping stone, because it's relentless. It's very exciting, and it's about conquistadors, and it kind of narrows itself down to one man's mad attempts to conquer a civilization on his own, essentially.
Yes.
But it's brilliant. It reminds me of the Shelley poem Ozymandias. It's sort of about, overweening pride and hubris. That's a really good entry point, I think. And also The Enigma of Caspar Hauser, which is 2 years after that, which is Herzog's retelling of a real life case of this diminutive figure who walked into a German town one day with no memory, and what happened to the rest of his life. I also really like Wojciech. There's some weird directions you can go in with Herzog. There's so many films. Among his documentaries, I think Grizzly Man is one of the absolute best. It's superb. It's about this.
I think that was my gateway into his stuff.
This about this guy called Timothy Treadwell and his obsession with grizzly bears and his ultimate fate. That's Herzog really confronting his feelings about what the natural world is, and it's the least David Attenborough vision of the natural world you could possibly get.
It's so true. It's so true. So there you go. I think it's what's so fascinating about these two movies from the same year is how different they are, right? And they're both takes on the same novel. I guess I just want to ask you, in your opinion, we've had other Draculas since, Francis Ford Coppola's. None have been particularly successful, right? What do you think the future is for Dracula and adaptations? Do you think that there's still life in that novel and, you know, doing something new for an adaptation for it?
Yeah, I think you have to not go in a trad direction anymore. And, you know, for all that it fell apart, the BBC three-parter
at least it tried
did some interesting stuff at the beginning.
Yeah.
And it had a very compelling Dracula in Klaus Bang. I don't know what the next Dracula film will be.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. Who has not put their stamp on it yet?
I know, right? And it's so hard, I think, to overcome. You know, I still think the shadow of Bela Lugosi kind of looms over the performance of Dracula too, right? I mean, even Gary Oldman to a point was sort of doing the Bela Lugosi accent and performance, wasn't he? I mean, apart from Christopher Lee, maybe those two are the kind of two towering Dracula performances as well, that it's hard to not compare to those two, you know?
Yeah, and I was just very impressed with a couple of films. I still am, for the kind of soul that it gives Dracula and the kind of substance that it gives him, as well as him being incredibly frightening.
Yes.
Especially when he's in that kind of weird white hair makeup job.
Yeah.
Licking blood off a razor.
Yeah.
Looking utterly unlike any version of Dracula anyone had ever seen.
Yeah.
So that film had a lot of novelty and kind of interesting visual ideas, because I think that was necessary at the time, because even Langella and certainly Christopher Lee became kind of parodied in, you know, the Carry On films and in kind of spoofs, in the Mel Brooks spoof, and so on. The Dracula was becoming played out. There had been too many of the Hammer Dracula films. Christopher Lee had done it too often, and so it became a bit of a shtick. And they needed to kind of pull the plug and do something new. And I think Kinski certainly did, and Gary Oldman did, and no one has quite managed it all the way to the finish since then. I don't know. It's going to take quite a fearless actor to go for it, and someone with real vision.
It's sad because I think Karen Kusama was going to make a new Dracula adaptation, and that's been kind of axed now. But
there's one with Luke Evans, isn't there?
There's
Dracula 2000,
which was pretty bad.
Where
I think Dracula turned out to be Judas Iscariot in the end, or something. There was some connection.
I've kind of forgotten that. Yeah.
There is a Nick Cage Dracula movie coming out next year. It's just called Renfield, so I think it's going to focus on the character of Renfield, but Nick Cage is playing the Count in that movie.
Who's playing Renfield?
Nicholas Hoult, I believe, is playing Renfield. So who knows? You know, with Nick Cage films, that can always sort of go either way, can't it? I think.
And they've already done that with Van Helsing as well. They did the kind of like comic book antics with Hugh Jackman,
which was a big failure.
Lousy.
Terrible, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, who knows? Who knows? We'll see. Amazing. Well, Tim, thank you so much. And final question for you, I have to ask: what's your favourite vampire film?
I think I'm going to answer with a three-way tie.
Yes, of course. Go for it.
Three-way tie on that would be this. Nosferatu the Vampire is one of those three. I really think it's tremendous. And I'm gonna put Coppola up there as well.
Nice.
And I'm gonna put Jim Jarmusch's Only Lovers Left Alive. Which is a very like offbeat sort of stoner variant on the vampire lore, stretching across centuries. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, the kind of it's a good. That's a good mix, isn't it? Because you've kind of got the romantic one, the scary one, and you've got that kind of Only Lovers Left Alive is sort of like the monotony of being undead, almost. You know, almost like know the boredom,
the chore of it.
Yeah, which is great. Amazing. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining me. It's been such a pleasure to have you back. And obviously, people can find more of your stuff at the Telegraph. But if they want to come find you and chat to you on Twitter or wherever, where can they find you?
Yeah, at trim_obey.
Amazing.
TRIM_OBEY.
Amazing. Tim, thank you very much. And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's brilliant guest, Tim Robey. Such a pleasure to finally have Tim back on the podcast. So let us know what you thought of this week's episode and what you think of these two films, Dracula from 1979 and Nosferatu the Vampire from the same year. How do they compare to other Dracula adaptations and other vampire movies for you? Drop us a line, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Facebook, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Twitter. If you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, then you can join 2 different places. You can sign up to our Discord, the Evolution of Horror Discord, or our Facebook group, the Evolution of Horror Discussion Group. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and I'd be so grateful if you could spare a minute to drop us a little rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever app you use, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So onwards to next week then, and we're finally reaching the end of our journey through Dracula adaptations. Next week, in the first half of the episode, I'm going to be joined by friend of the pod, Rosie Fletcher, and we are going to be discussing a movie that's been mentioned, I think, at least every week so far this series. We're going to be talking about Francis Ford Coppola's version of Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992. Then in the second half of the episode, Brad Hanson is going to be dropping in to give us a little Dracula also-rans and recommending some other Dracula movies that we haven't had time to cover in depth. So it's going to be a great fun episode. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.